This episode is sponsored by Smart Travel, a new podcast from NerdWallet. You know that one friend who always finds the best travel deals, picks the right cards, and somehow ends up in first class for the price of coach? How do they do that? Well, Smart Travel is like that friend, but in podcast form. They cover all things travel finance, like which travel cards earn their keep and which are just heavy, shiny metal, and planning group trips that won't ruin your budget or your friendships. So travel smarter and spend less. That's the key with help from NerdWallet. Follow Smart Travel wherever you get your podcasts. Armchair-Explorer is a part of the Voyescape podcast network. Check out all of their shows from around the world at voyescape.com.
It was easily 50 below zero and the wind was blowing. It was so cold that, going to the bathroom was taking your future into your hands. I remember spitting and hearing the spit freeze, but just crackle, frozen before it hit the snow. You couldn't hold on to your ice axe, even with the 3 layers of gloves that we had on our hands, because the metal was so cold. So we were letting our ice axe dangle from the wrist straps, so not to touch the metal. I felt for many days, on the climb in particular, that I was going to die. I was certain that I was going to die. And for the first time in my life, I started praying.
Hey guys, welcome to Armchair Explorer. My name's Aaron Miller. I'm a travel writer and your host. Today we're going to be taking a journey to the Arctic Circle in the far north of the American continent. This is a story about climbing and surviving one of the tallest mountains on Earth. It's about paddling through the most remote national park in America, the gates of the Arctic. And it's about finding wonder and hope in places where that hope is nearly lost. Are you ready to go from the shadow of Denali into the Thaw? Yeah, me too. Let's go. Taking us on this adventure is Jon Waterman, who, if you haven't heard of him, is a bit of a legend among lovers of adventure and the mountains. He's written tons of amazing books that fuse together almost like a kind of nature poetry alongside his incredible stories of adventure and expedition over the years. His latest book is called Into the Thaw: Witnessing Wonder Amid the Arctic Climate Crisis. It's basically like a collection of short stories about lots of his trips up in the Arctic, as well as beautiful photography. So definitely worth checking that out, as well as lots of his other work too. So we're going to put details in the show notes, or you can head over to jonathanwaterman.com to find out more. So I don't want to dilly-dally too much. Let's get on with the show. But if I can, I would just like to ask a quick favor. We're really trying to grow our audience this year. It's the only way that we can keep bringing these kind of stories to you. So if you like it, please consider passing that on. Tell a friend, a fellow traveler or adventurer who you think might like it too. That word of mouth is the best possible thing you can do. Or if you really want to push the boat out, go on. You can share it on social media too, and tag me on Instagram if you do, at Armchair-Explorer Podcast. Follow me there too. If you do, I'll make sure to share one of your adventures too, if you'd like. But for now, let's set the scene. The name Denali in native Athabascan means the Great One. It is the highest mountain in North America and the third highest of the 7 summits, the tallest peaks in each of the 7 continents. But more than that, Denali is the queen of the Arctic, a giant of stone and storm in a land of light and unbounded exploration. And that's where we're going now.
It was the mountain, of course, that drew me, but it was also the just immense wilderness of Alaska and the whole experience of Alaska as the last frontier that really set the hook. I've spent so much of my time up there, if not on the mountain, around the mountain in the surrounding wilderness. What's magnificent about it is that it is not terribly accessible. You have to fly in to 7,000 feet just to begin your climb. It is truly a wilderness area that happens to have the highest mountain in North America and smack dab in the middle of it. And if you're up high on the mountain when a storm comes in, you don't necessarily even have to be going for the summit. A storm at 16 or 17,000 feet, several thousand feet below the summit, can be taking your life into your own hands, you know, with winds that would bowl you over, blow you right off the ridge. So it's a great place to start a mountaineering career, let alone to learn about survival in cold places.
Howard Zahniser, the early 20th century conservationist, wrote, "Denali is one of the places where the heart of the world can beat undisturbed." Rising 20,310 feet from sea level, the upper half is permanently covered in snow and glaciers, some more than 30 miles across. In winter, temperatures can plummet to minus 100 degrees Fahrenheit or less. Gusts of wind race past at 200 miles an hour. Outside of Antarctica, it is the coldest place on Earth. And yet, hundreds of people attempt to climb it each year.
The first, albeit disputed, ascent of the mountain was in 1910 by 4 gold miners. And what's inspirational about it is that, for one, they had very little experience aside from living and working in the cold and, you know, working hard as bears out there digging in their gold mines. And if it's true, what they did was extraordinary, even by today's standards, because they claimed to have climbed the mountain in one sort of lightning fast 18-hour round trip go from 9,000 feet on the Muldrow Glacier all the way to the North Summit and back, with no fixed ropes or no setting up the route whatsoever, really fueled only by donuts and coffee.
Since then, out of the roughly 24,000 people that have attempted to reach its summit, only about half have succeeded. More than 100 have died in the process. Denali is known as one of the most dangerous mountains in the world, not for the difficulty of its climbing, but for the severity of its weather. Jon first attempted it when he was 19 with a group of 7 other friends in his Boy Scout troop. It was a great learning experience, he says, but it wasn't how he wanted to climb it. They had huge packs, they had to climb slowly, it was ponderous, he says. So he returned a few years later after gaining more experience in the mountains and did an alpine ascent of a challenging route, which was a huge success for a young, aspiring mountaineer. But it wasn't enough for Jon.
I wanted to do something unequivocal, and I wanted to push myself in a way that I hadn't felt fully challenged before in any of my previous climbs. So I got together a small team, 2 other guys, in 1982, and we went to the mountain in the dead of winter, and we flew under the glacier in late February of 1982 to climb the Cassin Ridge in winter. At that point, the mountain had only been climbed once in the wintertime by some friends of mine, by the standard West Buttress route. Art Davidson wrote a book about it called Minus 148, which is what he estimated the wind chill to be. I wanted to improve upon that climb by taking on a more challenging route, the Cassin Ridge that cleaves the south face and leads almost directly to the summit, but to do it quickly in alpine style, rather than carrying heavy loads and walking up the West Buttress route. But we ultimately were very lucky to get away with our lives.
On February 17th, 1982, Jon and his 2 climbing partners, Mike Young and Roger Meir, flew into the Kahiltna Glacier in the dead of winter. For 10 days, they trudged across the ice towards the relentless north wind and the start of the Cassin Ridge. And throughout all that time, Jon couldn't shake the feeling that he was going to die up there. Haunted, he writes, by a diurnal dread that I had stepped away from the living. To begin with, the climbing was beautiful, snow crystals sparkling in the high-altitude air by day, the northern lights above them by night, translucent bands of jade and saffron stealing time in the cold from us, he writes. I loved it more than I have ever loved a mountain before or since. But as they got higher, now above 18,000 feet, the altitude made them weaker and sick, and the temperature began to plummet.
was easily 50 below zero and the wind was blowing. It was so cold that, going to the bathroom was taking your future into your hands. I remember spitting and hearing the spit freeze, but just crackle, frozen before it hit the snow. You couldn't hold on to your ice axe, even with the 3 layers of gloves that we had on our hands, because the metal was so cold. So we were letting our ice axe dangle from the wrist straps, so not to touch the metal. I felt for many days, on the climb in particular, that I was going to die. I was certain that I was going to die. And for the first time in my life, I started praying.
The next morning, Roger and Mike raced ahead, but Jon couldn't follow. He was dizzy and weak. He couldn't concentrate, couldn't catch his breath. After a paltry 1,000 feet, they were forced to build a dangerous bivvy on the edge of the mountain and set up camp for the night. We piled into the tent. I was too weak to talk. My world spun and dipped and hovered as I held my head and tried to find my breath. Will plied me with tea while Roger looked out the door and analyzed the sky. They took turns looking out of the tent as if something were coming to get us. I'll never forget their wide eyes, the creases on their foreheads, the tension that shook the tent like the wind. I closed my eyes and let sickness spin me away from the bitter realities into unconsciousness. That night, the tent became a frozen coffin. It was here. Death is so omnipotent that it wins merely by reducing you so low and removing all of your hope and making you so scared that you simply give up and lay back and let it take you. He dreamed of drowning and woke at dawn thrashing for life. He had the beginnings of a pulmonary edema, a common killer among mountaineers. But there would be no retreat for Jon.
Life was reduced to its simplest form. There was a kind of beauty in that there was only one thing to do. I had to get up, to get down. We certainly couldn't rappel the route. And I had to just continue up. There was no other choice. Life was so reduced. But it was also quite frightening, too, because I could barely stand up. I had no balance. And, one slip. At that point, it was too cold to rope up. So if I had slipped, I would have gone all the way off the mountain. I, at that point, was very sick, and in fact, crawled to the summit ridge. I was so sick, and Mike, one of the third team member, actually came down and carried my pack so I could crawl the rest of the way to the summit ridge. But it was like another world being on top of that mountain above 19,000 feet, just so alien that the landscape everything was just frozen solid with beautiful rime ice. And the day we got to the top was in a solid undercast, so we could see the whole world below us just as a world of clouds with a few peaks sticking out. I don't know how I made it down. To this day, we walked down the West Buttress route, and there's a very tricky section that is now referred to as the Audubon, where a lot of climbers have fallen and been badly hurt or killed. And since I was sick and moving so slowly, my teammates went ahead without me. And somehow I stumbled down that section. There were no fixed ropes there, without slipping and falling, often stopping, every 20 yards to just sit down and catch my breath because I had the beginnings of pulmonary edema. Finally, the next day, a storm came rolling in. We down-climbed the final bit of the head wall on the West Buttress route. And I remember there were some fixed ropes there, and I got off the last fixed rope, and I just fell down over the bergschrund and just in a heap. And we walked down. There was a camp of British climbers there who were just amazed that people were coming down out of this storm. We felt so lucky to be alive. We couldn't believe what we had done.
At base camp, they collapsed into the warmth of a snow cave, gorged themselves on food, and drank hot cocoa. Tears welled in Jon's eyes, and he buried his head in his sleeping bag to hide them. They had survived. But the ordeal was not quite done yet.
Two of us myself included, had frostbite. Roger Muir fell into a crevasse at the end of the trip and severed his knee ligaments. And then we were left there for 10 days at base camp. The bush pilot was on a long drunk, so we were kind of desperate derelicts sitting in a snow cave for 10 days with frostbite, and one of us Roger could no longer walk. So it was one of the most desperate times of my life. Several days into that long period of waiting for a bush pilot did fly in, a very sober gentleman. His name was Lowell Thomas Jr. He was the lieutenant governor of Alaska. And he did fly in, and he landed 3 Spanish climbers. And the bush pilot, Lowell, walked to the edge of our snow cave, and he shouted into our snow cave because he saw our ice axes outside of the snow cave. "Hello, anyone in there?" And we didn't hear him because the snow muffles all the sound. We didn't hear the plane land either. And he figured that we were out on another climb, and he got back in his plane and flew out. I went out to take a pee, and I saw ski plane tracks next to our snow cave and a tent with 3 Spaniards in it. And I thought I was dreaming. I went over and shook the tent wall, and they looked at me like they were seeing a ghost. They never came into the snow cave and checked it out. They just set up their tent. So after that, we were so desperate. We had no radio that worked. We had a little hand walkie-talkie, but it wouldn't get out of the range. Our bush pilot was still in a long drunk. I won't mention his name. But we stamped a giant OUT in the snow. Get us out of here. And it just so happened that, a week later, another bush pilot came in. Cliff Hudson was his name. And he saw the OUT and he landed. He was only in a Super Cub, so he could just fit the worst of the 3 of us in the plane, which was Roger. And he flew Roger directly to the hospital. And he got the other bush pilot out of his drunken stupor to come in and get us.
The months that followed were hard. Next to climbing Denali in winter, he writes, everything, relationships, work, exercise seemed worthless. It took me months to readapt to normal living. And because he'd put everything into Denali, he didn't have a cent to his name and no plan for what would come next. But then, fate played a hand. Hey guys, I just want to do a quick shout out for Jon's latest book. It's called Into the Thaw. He's an awesome guy. He actually came into the studio to record this episode, so I got to meet him in person, and it was a real honor. So I wanted to give him a little extra shout out here to say thanks for that. Into the Thaw is a beautiful book. It's published by Patagonia, who of course are awesome as well, and that should give you an idea of the kind of book it is. So if you're looking for your next adventure read, or if you're like me and you just like to collect beautiful travel books for your bookshelf or coffee table. Am I the only one that does that, by the way? I kind of like just to be surrounded by great adventure writing and photography and dip into it now and again. Well, this is a great one for that because it's really just a collection of essays and short stories about Jon's lifetime love affair with the far north and the Arctic Circle. So go ahead and check it out. Into the Thaw, Witnessing Wonder Amid the Arctic Climate Crisis is the name of the book, and jonathanwaterman.com is his website. And now, just a few more words from our sponsors.
In part because I climbed the mountain in the wintertime, I got a job as a mountaineering ranger in Denali National Park. I had no right being hired for that job otherwise, because I didn't respect authority, and it was a joke to me to wear a uniform. But I loved the job. It was the best job of my life because I was tasked with educating climbers, not only educating them, but rescuing them and hauling off dead bodies off the mountain. So I really learned a lot. But when the climbing season was over, the Park Service would find things for us to do, and they sent me north to Gates of the Arctic National Park on an exchange patrol, which I really saw as a boondoggle. And I went on a week-long float trip in Gates of the Arctic National Park on the Noatak River with a friend of mine who happened to be the backcountry ranger in that park. And it was an extraordinary experience that changed my life in many ways, nothing even akin to climbing Denali in the wintertime, of course. But it changed my life because it was the wildest of all national parks that you could ever imagine being in. We were surrounded by migrating caribou, and the caribou were chased by all matter predators, which, they swimming the river and running past our tent so close that you could smell their breath. And we were just aghast. I was aghast the whole trip, catching fish and discovering a wolf den, watching a grizzly disemboweling a caribou. The whole thing was as if we were let loose on the plains of Serengeti. We were being paid to do this stuff.
Gates of the Arctic is the northernmost and least visited of all America's national parks. It averages about 10,000 visitors a year. That's it. And most of those don't go much further than the visitor center. It has no roads, no campsites or trails. But John Muir called it the most extensive, least spoiled, and most unspoilable of the gardens of the continent, which is high praise indeed. And it is vast, 8 million acres of Arctic tundra, lonely peaks, and wild rivers. I couldn't help but feel unsettled, John writes, even reduced by the immense sky and landscape that surrounded us.
It has a hallucinogenic quality, and that's coupled with the fact that there's a complete lack of visual cues in much of the Arctic, because there aren't people around, for one thing. There are no trails, except for caribou trails everywhere, spiderwebbing the hillsides, going nowhere and everywhere. And there are no buildings, there are no trees. And then you have this surreal light, like something out of a surrealist painting. And you can't tell if a nearby ground squirrel is a grizzly bear. And it's really kind of a hallucinogenic. It gets you out of your own head, for one thing. And I've always been immensely curious about the world around me, and being thrust into this place where you're made to feel small and reductive allows you to really bear down and use your powers of observation and to learn. And so I became a student of the Arctic.
That trip, perhaps even more than Denali, was the beginning of John's long love affair with the Arctic. After it, he returned to Denali and his work as a ranger, but it felt somehow empty now, too contained. So less than a year later, after just 4 seasons with the Park Service, he quit his job, swapping glacial mountains and a steady career for remote wilderness trips in the land and seascapes of the far north. Time passed, and then, more than a dozen years and Arctic trips later, he found himself on the edge of the Northwest Passage with a dream to paddle solo across the roof of North America.
I knew that all the tricks, so that made it relatively easy for me to sort of go to the next level, because I wasn't afraid of being cold. Sure, I was afraid of falling in ice water and then having to deal with being hypothermic. But mastery to me was about being able to go for days and days on end and not get tendinitis and not get caught in a storm off a shore, and to really begin to use my instinct. And I actually didn't know about that before it started happening. And what happened in this pursuit of mastery and in wanting to cross the Northwest Passage alone is became intensely intuitive about everything around me, about the weather, about animals. And it would only happen after more than a week away from a village, when I was intensely alone without a satellite phone. Now all my friends have Garmin inReaches, and they routinely are texting their girlfriends. And I've never been interested in that. And it was a lucky thing, because I was interested in self-sufficiency. And that self-sufficiency, in turn, was a doorway to this remarkable intuition that I believe that we all have inside of us. I think it's a kind of a genetic or ancestral thing, that many of our ancestors were hunters that had to live out on the land. And for instance, I would know when there was a bear around without seeing its tracks or smelling it or seeing it or hearing it. I could tell when I was in the presence of another animal. And I became intensely calm. I described it as loose-limbed. After a week or so alone out of a village, when I'd be alone for as long as 25 days without seeing or talking to another soul, let alone seeing an airplane or a boat. The sections of the Canadian Arctic are intensely remote. There is no jet traffic whatsoever, let alone small plane traffic. And, for weeks on end, I didn't see a contrail even. And that's a remarkable experience. I felt so privileged, not lucky, but privileged because I sought it out.
It took 10 months spread over 3 years to cross the Northwest Passage. He'd come to test himself, his mastery of Arctic survival and the sheer endurance of a 2,200-mile adventure filled with errant bears and storms and mosquitoes and cold and exhaustion. And while the solo paddle did test him, it was the people of the Arctic that inspired him the most. Every time I emerged in an Inuit village or hunting camp, he writes, I came to a new level of appreciation for the remarkable Inuit. Their perspective on the natural world and its wild animals changed my ways. I learned a new appreciation for true wilderness. I routinely talked to wildlife. I became content to be quiet rather than badger strangers with questions. And I gained a new appreciation for the many privileges and freedoms I hold in my life. And it was in that spirit, in the summer of 2021, that he decided to return to the place where his love affair had first begun. The Noatak River in the gates of the Arctic National Park.
I had seen the evidence and heard the evidence from Inuit people of climate change as early as 1997. But it wasn't until this trip that I took with my son in 2021 that I became intensely aware of it, because this was a trip to that first place that I went to in 1983 that changed my life. And I had returned there the following 2 summers, and I worked as a guide on the Noatak River. I was intimately familiar with that stretch of river, but then I stopped going there in the mid-1980s and went to other places in the Arctic, and it wasn't until more than 36 years later that I returned. And of course, I had a distinct memory. It was embossed in my memory cells that what this place was like, and to see it so different, so brushy and river flooded. And my son and I were swimming in the river, which is something I'd never dreamed of doing 3 decades earlier. That is what incited me to return and more carefully document what was going on the following summer, 2022.
The beauty of the Arctic, that hallucinogenic light, was still there. His son Alistair, who was 15 at the time, was wide-eyed with wonder, he says. He taught him how to call birds and track animals. They saw a grizzly and her cubs just a few hundred feet from their camp. He wanted Alistair's senses to open up with appreciation for this wild place and let him find a sense of his place and purpose amid a time of chaos and climate crisis. But as the trip neared its end, he realized he wanted to share that with others too. So the following year, along with professional kayaker and photographer Chris Korbilik, he returned into the Thaw to document the changes he had seen.
One of the things that we observed frequently was this phenomenon known as thermokarsting, which is simply the permafrost thawing beneath the surface of the ground, and the ground collapses, looking like landslides on slopes or sinkholes on flat ground. And that's happening across the Arctic and as far down as southern parts of Alaska in the subarctic. And of course the sea ice. And it's the lack of sea ice that's causing that coastline of Alaska to become the most rapidly eroding coastline in the world, because the sea ice protects the coastline, prevents the storms from battering the coast, prevents the storms from inundating the villages. So that's one of the most shocking things. And the ice becomes a highway for the people to travel on in the wintertime, but with the seasons becoming shorter and shorter and the ice becoming thinner, the highway is no longer safe to travel on. And then there's another phenomenon known as the greening of the Arctic, where the brush is moving north along with the tree line. There are now trees growing in places that never grew in the Arctic.
Where 30 years earlier, herds of caribou filled the tundra, now only a handful walked past. Every campsite he knew and remembered had been washed out. The land was bogged, the mountains bereft of snow. As they traveled, they stopped at Inuit villages along the way, and as before, these were the places that inspired him the most. There is a story told of Noatak, an Inuit prophet who was born in the early 1800s and foretold of great changes. He said that people would come from the south and east with white-colored skin and that they would bring books for the people to understand. His prophecies spoke of crafts powered by fire that would go up the rivers and carry people through the air, of a great city and how people would pull things from the ground that would make them rich. He predicted a time of famine. And of course, many of those prophecies have come true. Starvation caused by whalers, the time of the missionaries and Bible books, the mines. But Noatak spoke these warnings not in despair, but to prepare his people for a changing world, that they might meet it with knowledge and hope. Their journey ended at the village of Kuvalina, which in many ways, he says, is the epicenter of that change that Noatak spoke of. It was originally predicted to be underwater by 2025 and now is fending that off barely by a half-mile seawall. That's it. But despite the environmental changes he witnessed, the lasting impression he was left with here and in other villages and hunting camps he visited was the cultural strength that he found.
I left with a great deal of hope, and one of the places that I found hope was in the people themselves, the Inupiat people. They're ever resilient. They have adapted to change over the centuries and over the millennia, and they will adapt, although many of them are going to be forced to relocate. And the earth will endure. The subtitle of my book is Witnessing Wonder. And I felt on that trip, and when I return, I know that I'll have the opportunity to continue witnessing wonder. And hopefully my grandchildren will too.
Jon's journey into the Thaw is part lament and part love poem. For what he sees through the eyes of a young man, an older man, and in the eyes of his son is the effect that those wild places have on us. That is where his hope comes from. The wisdom and resilience of the people of the Arctic, and the wonder it inspires in all those who visit. Thank you, Jon. Thank you for taking us on this journey from the shadow of Denali into the Thaw and the beauty and landscapes of the far north. If you enjoyed this episode, I highly recommend you check out Jon's books. The new one is called Into the Thaw, Witnessing Wonder Amid the Arctic Climate Crisis. It's a really beautiful book, but he's written a bunch of others too, and you can find out all about them on his website, jonathanwaterman.com, or just check out the show notes. Quick favor to ask from me personally too, if you did like what you heard today on the show, it would be great if you could follow and subscribe. We are really trying to grow this audience. That is how we can continue to bring these kind of stories to you. So when you follow and subscribe, when you tell a friend, when you leave a review, that is a great way to help us do that and to support the show. You can also reach out to me on Instagram at armchair-explorer podcast. I don't know about you, but I am dreaming of going up to Gates of the Arctic National Park one of these days, and Denali. I've been there once. It's stunning, barely scratched the surface. Although I might miss the summit in winter. Yeah. Anyway, what are you dreaming of? What adventure has this trip inspired in you? I'd love to know. And until then, well, I'm going to leave you with a quote that Jon opens that book with. It's from the writer E.B. White, and it says, "Always be on the lookout for the presence of wonder." Why? Well, the more we look for wonder in the world, the more the wonder of the world becomes a part of who we are. Dare to be truly alive. Armchair Explorer is produced by Armchair Productions, the audio experts for the travel industry. Find our other shows at armchair-productions.com. Charles Tyree did the audio editing and sound design for today's episode. Jason Patton is our lead producer. My name's Aaron Miller. I write and present the show. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.
Quick question. Do you want travel tips from people who have actually been there?
Our show is co-hosted by Tim Johnson, an award-winning travel journalist who's been to more than 145 countries around the world. And I'm David Brody, the other co-host who's been travel podcasting for 20 years while traveling to 50-plus countries around the world.
In about 10 or 20 minutes per show, we break down a destination with the kind of insight you usually only get from long guidebooks or hours of research.
So if you want expert advice, zero fluff, and travel inspiration that you can actually use, search for Travel in 10 wherever you listen to podcasts, or you can also find us at boyescape.com.
Hi, I'm Pauline Fromer, host of the Fromer's Travel Podcast. We post new episodes weekly, detailing the kinds of money-saving tips and cultural insights that will make your trips richer without making you significantly poorer. We do so by interviewing real travel experts like TV host Samantha Brown, Fromer's authors from around the globe, and such public figures as Free Solo's Alex Honnold. It's a fun travel party. I hope you can join us.